So let's talk about this one exception, this Postal Acceptance Rule. Case is Adams and Lindsell. Get there eventually. Ultimately, I've spoken about this already a little bit. The principle here is when the communication is made by post, the communication is deemed to occur at the time that it's put into the post. Why? Let's think about the logic. Why?
Because you have no control once that letter leaves your hand.
You have no control. When this is made 1818, in the UK, in London, you have 4 postal runs a day. Post was a pretty efficient communication tool compared to other options that were available to you. It was quite usual for there to be records kept of where things went in the post. It's outside your control, it's in a third party's hands. The case also considers this idea that the method of communication might be prescribed by the agreement as well. That the offer itself might require acceptance to come by post. So it's particularly important in those kind of situations. So it's important to remember too, because in our minds, I think we think of email as being sort of post 2.0, I think. We do think about the way that, you know, my nana would write a letter, I now send an email. So we do tend to think of them as an evolutionary process, but they're actually quite different from each other. And this is an exception to the general rule. So the Postal Rule is a common law rule which applies in relation to non-instantaneous communications. So whilst it does apply in relation to post, it probably applies in some other circumstances as well. For example, putting a letter or, I don't know, something that signifies your acceptance, giving it to a courier to deliver. So using UPS or whatever the different brands are instead of using the post would have the same effect. In commercial situations, this hardly ever happens because nobody really wants this to be the end result anymore. So usually in the documentation, you will deal with a particular methodology, as I was mentioning before, for deeming when notices are received and when what amount of time that you have to deal with them.
Well, they used as well, sort of before, I guess, there was electronic signatures and things. They used to be sort of 2 forms. You know, one they'd say scan it through to say you've signed, but also send it in the mail as well.
Yeah, well, and the thing is, a lot of people are still doing that, and kind of, again, because we understand contract law, we understand what these rules are, we know unless a formality says, well, you will know this a bit later, unless a formality says it has to be in writing, then we know we don't really need writing. And even when the law says it needs to be in writing or there needs to be a document, we understand that a document is not just a paper document. Now it's interesting, in relation to deeds, in theory at least, a deed used to have to be written on parchment or vellum. So vellum is actually deer skin. I find that kind of just weird, like a little bit kind of, I don't know, like something out of Harry Potter or something. It's part of a spell that you have to, and it needed to have an actual physical seal with wax in order to be a proper deal, a proper deed. But other formalities, they just need to be in writing. Signature we'll talk about later, but signature, particularly when the rules were developing around signature, literacy rates were quite low. So signature has a very broad interpretation. Signature is a mark that means you. And yet we still have this kind of commercial idea, I don't know, just the lawyers somehow scare commercial people along the way, that we have to have, often referred to as wet signatures. I don't actually understand why you need a wet signature at all. And they're very rarely actually wet either. It's just a very strange process, but think about these things. There are, whilst the postal exception, the postal rule is an exception to the general rule, there can be exceptions to the exception as well. So Hentham and Fraser is a good example of that, where the circumstances are such that it must have been within the contemplation of the parties that in according with the ordinary usages of mankind, the post might be used as a means of communicating the acceptance of an offer. The acceptance is complete as soon as it's posted. Contract is made when the acceptance is posted, even if it's lost in the post. I've said that's an exception, and the case itself is not talking about it being an exception. The paragraph that I've got up there, the question in that particular case was post the right way to deal with the acceptance if there have been communications in other ones? And so those of you who've been doing Zeta and Susanna, and for the online students, I will be looking at those problems tomorrow. I don't think I've seen anybody in this group have a go at answering the Zeta and Susanna problem online, but part of the issue there comes up with that there are all these different forms of communication. There's telephone calls, there's faxes, I think there's an email thrown in there as well. So the question becomes, well, which happens first, in what order, how do we need to think about that? So I'll leave you to that. It's good sort of exam problem, so I don't think you'll have any issue with it. We've talked about the reasons. So courier telegrams also, the postal rule applies in relation to telegram. I doubt any of you are ever going to have an actual problem that involves offer and acceptance by telegram, but if you do, that would be so cool. But just in case, you should point it out. Instantaneous communications fall within the general rule. And now we have clarification around that because of the Electronic Communications Acts in each of the states. So what's an instantaneous communication? Sorry?
Email.
Email would be an instantaneous communication. What I'm doing now, talking to you, it's instantaneous communication. So an oral contract is made at the time and the place that the words are spoken. Now, the language can get a little bit dense in the Act. In the electronic communication, we're talking about the contract being made at the place and the time that it's first able to be read or retrieved by the recipient. So that means it needs to leave the sender's outbox, it needs to leave their server and hit whatever server it is that the receiver can receive it for. It doesn't matter whether or not they do actually collect it. What matters is what time it's first able to be collected.
So it doesn't matter what time they read it?
No, what time they read it isn't relevant. It's what time they're first able to read it.